Tonight, we're stepping into rooms where the lamps burn low and the walls remember more than they reveal. The Vatican is marble and music on the surface, but beneath the frescoes and polished floors lies a paper trail of edits, omissions, and locked drawers' story. Some insist Leonardo only hinted at in paint and mirror script. We're not here to worship conspiracy or mock belief. We're here to trace the seam where art, power, and truth were stitched together and maybe tug a little. If you find yourself sinking comfortably into these late-night excavations of hidden history, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time glows on your clock. I like knowing the hour your curiosity woke up. Dim the lights, let a fan hum or rain track murmur, and breathe easy. Beauty and darkness both live in this tale. Let's walk in quietly and see what's been kept in shadow. Beneath the marble floor of St. Peter's Basilica, below Bernini's bronze canopy and the echo of choirs, there is a necropolis sealed in the 4th century and rediscovered during excavations ordered by Pius XII in the early 1940s. The Vatican opened a narrow tourist path through part of it, yet archivists and archaeologists admit there are side corridors still closed, masonry seams that lead to chambers mapped only in internal reports. Since 1612, the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, today called the Apostolic Archive, has stored papal correspondence and state papers, but older strata of writing survive in catacombs and private chapels, where early Christians carved symbols of fish and loaves beside women raising hands in blessing. No document authenticated by modern scholarship claims a bloodline from Jesus, yet councils did choose which Gospels were canonical. At Nicaea, in 325 bishops debated Christ's nature, not Magdalene's role, but later synods in the 12th and 13th centuries quietly narrowed which voices were cited in law. Leonardo worked briefly in Rome, around 1513 under Giuliano de' Medici, and complained in letters of men of the church who think only of geometry for machines of war, a clue that his curiosity brushed against clerical limits. If a sealed passage under the basilica holds anything tied to that coded legacy, it would not rest on a shelf with call numbers. It would be bricked behind a wall and logged in a ledger that never leaves a single desk. Tonight we start at that wall, at the point where stone keeps a secret and ink was never allowed to speak. Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Rome late in 1513 and stayed until 1516, lodging near the Belvedere courtyard while Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, ruled a court obsessed with spectacle and revenue. Contemporary notes from his assistant Francesco Melzi record frustrations with stalled experiments and blocked access to anatomical corpses because papal physicians controlled cadavers for sanctioned study. Leonardo wrote to Giuliano de' Medici complaining that rivals accused him of sorcery for devices that lifted water and bent light, complaints that echo his habit of writing in mirror script to slow casual readers rather than to cloak treason. During those same years, the Lateran Council V met in Rome between 1512 and 1517, concerned with reform of preaching and censorship of printed books, a reminder that ideas could be condemned before they reached the press. The Vatican had already maintained the index of prohibited books in embryo form, later formalized under Paul IV in 1559, So an artist who mixed theology, optics, and anatomy walked a narrow path, watched by clerics who feared scandal as much as heresy. No surviving letter proves Leonardo negotiated directly with curial officials about hidden gospels or Magdalene traditions, yet patronage tied him to families who did. Cardinal Bernardo Dovizi da Bibbiena, a Medici ally, staged comedies in the Apostolic Palace while scholars whispered about apocrypha stored in the Greek college. It is plausible Leonardo overheard more than he painted. His Last Supper in Milan predates Rome by 2 decades, painted in the 1490s, but copyists in the 16th century altered gestures, sometimes enlarging the figure of John, sometimes rendering that figure more feminine. The Church bought and sequestered many such copies in the 17th century to control devotional images. If there was a bargain, it lived in favors traded, studio doors opened or closed, and an artist who left Rome quietly when the novelty wore thin. When Pope Paul IV issued the first formal index of prohibited books in 1559, the machinery for silencing awkward texts finally had a printed spine, but the habit of suppression was older. Visible in the Council of Trent sessions between 1545 and 1563, that standardized scripture use and liturgical practice. Well before Dan Brown turned symbol into plot, Church scholars in the 16th century debated how to treat apocryphal writings such as the Gospel of Mary, known only from later Coptic copies, rediscovered in the 19th and 20th centuries, but hinted at in medieval catalogues as a text to be avoided. The Magdalene feast was fixed on 22 July and officially emphasized repentance after Gregory the Great's sermon in 591 conflated Mary of Magdala with the anonymous sinful woman of Luke, a decision that shaped Western devotion for centuries. Art responded in kind. Caravaggio painted a penitent Magdalene around 1594, now in the Doria Pamphilj collection, while Titian offered luxuriant hair and tears in Venetian studios, images that reinforced contrition rather than authority. Inside the Vatican archives, founded by Paul V in 1612, curators classified manuscripts by provenance and utility, and anything that risked doctrinal confusion was stamped with restricted access. Reports from the excavations beneath St. Blaise. Peter's begun in 1939 under Pius XII, were published selectively in 1951 to announce the likely tomb of Peter, yet technical appendices describing side galleries remained internal. In Provence, the cult of Mary Magdalene at Saint Maximin la Saint Baume was promoted from the 13th century, a fact the Vatican tolerated as legend while quietly discouraging genealogical fantasies that tied her to royal lines. These are hard facts on record, but between them sits a gray zone of choices, which sermon to endorse, which image to buy, which scholar to fund, which corridor to lock. That is where a truth can be hidden, without a single false sentence ever being written. The Gospel of Mary, preserved in Coptic fragments from the 5th century, found at Achmim in 1896, and in the Berlin Codex acquired in 1896 but published in 1955, presents Mary of Magdala as a recipient of private teaching, a role uncomfortable for hierarchies that preferred apostolic succession through Peter and Paul. The Nag Hammadi Library, unearthed in Egypt in 1945, added the Gospel of Philip, which speaks of the companion of the Savior without naming marriage, a phrase scholars argue over endlessly. Rome did not publicly denounce these finds as heresy, because academic debate could be allowed to ebb in journals while catechisms stayed unchanged. In 1969, the Roman calendar reform under Paul VI reduced some saints' feasts and quietly adjusted Magdalene's liturgical texts. Then, in 2016, Pope Francis elevated her memorial to a feast, calling her apostle to the apostles, yet the decree avoided any suggestion of sacramental authority or bloodline. Meanwhile, Leonardo's notebooks, the Codex Atlanticus in Milan, and the Arundel in London show his reversed writing and studies of proportion. None contain explicit theology, yet his habit of embedding riddles feeds speculation that paintings like The Virgin of the Rocks contain layered iconography. The Louvre version was completed around 1486, the London version later, both showing an angel pointing toward John the Baptist, while the Virgin's hand hovers protectively. Scholars argue composition, the Church argues doctrine, and the public sees possibility. In the Vatican Library, founded formally in 1475 by Sixtus IV, access depends on credentials, and while researchers can consult 15 centuries of material, the most sensitive diplomatic dossiers are released only after a pope decides, as happened in 2020 when archives of Pius XII were opened. Selectivity is a filter as effective as a lock. Thus, the question is not whether a single parchment proves a lineage, but whether consistent editorial pressure across centuries shaped what the faithful could imagine. In 897, Pope Stephen VI convened the Cadaver Synod, placing the corpse of Pope Formosus on trial, a grotesque reminder that Roman politics could weaponize ritual to erase inconvenient predecessors. 6 centuries later, in 1303, Guillaume de Nogaret, acting for Philip IV of France, assaulted Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni after the bull Unam Sanctam of 1302 claimed submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation, showing how papal assertions of absolute authority provoke violent backlash. These facts matter because they reveal a pattern. When narrative control falters, force fills the gap. Leonardo's own patrons navigated that world. In 1492, Rodrigo Borgia became Alexander VI through simony that shocked contemporaries like Johann Burchard, and under him Cesare Borgia hired Leonardo as military engineer in 1502. Leonardo drafted canal schemes for the Romagna and studied fortifications, leaving notebooks, now in the Codex Madrid I discovered in 1967. While with Cesare, he visited Imola, mapping the town with striking accuracy. None of this ties him to secret gospels, but it places him in circles where power and secrecy entwined. The Council of Constance between 1414 and 1418 ended the Western Schism by deposing or accepting the resignation of 3 rival popes, another moment when legitimacy depended on documents burned or sealed. The Archivum Secretum, though only named secret in the sense of private, has always required papal permission for access and releases its holdings progressively, meaning absence in public catalogues may reflect policy rather than non-existence. Renaissance artists frequently encoded patron messages. Botticelli's Mystic Nativity painted in 1,500 references the Book of Revelation in Greek above the scene, mixing scripture and private anxiety after Savonarola's Florence burned vanities. If Botticelli could hide text in plain sight, Leonardo could too, yet proof demands more than symmetry and rumor. The Vatican's tendency to rename, reorder, and restrict is documented, whether that restraint guards doctrine or buries disruptive history is the line we will keep testing. Galileo Galilei stood before the Roman Inquisition in 1633, not only for astronomy, but for daring to read scripture with lenses that frightened theologians, and the decree that forced his abjuration cited the Congregation of the Index created in 1571 to police printed thought. The machinery that silenced him is the same bureaucracy that reviewed mystical diaries, apocryphal translations, and any manuscript that blurred the line between revelation and rumor. The Society of Jesus, approved by Paul III in 1540, became both missionary spearhead and intellectual firewall, running colleges that taught rhetoric and mathematics while advising popes on which texts to suppress. Jesuit Athanasius Kircher published on hieroglyphs in 1652 in Oedipus Aegyptiacus, misreading Egyptian signs yet proving Rome's appetite for controlled exotic knowledge. 3 years earlier, in 1649, Nicolas Poussin painted the Shepherds of Arcadia, whose Latin motto, Et in Arcadia ego, later inspired theories of hidden tombs and secret bloodlines, and a Vatican envoy reportedly viewed the canvas before it left for France. The Archivio Segreto received its modern cataloging push under Leo XIII when he opened it to scholars in 1881, but only documents up to certain pontificates are released at any given time, a rolling curtain of disclosure. When Francis, in 2019, renamed it the Apostolic Archive to soften the word secret, nothing in access policy changed. Meanwhile, relic cults continued in Provence, where Charles II of Anjou in 1279 promoted discovery of Magdalene's remains at St. Maximin, a political move to sanctify his rule in the south of France, recorded by Jacobus de Voragine's Golden Legend. Rome never authenticated those bones, yet never crushed the pilgrimage economy either. This blend of tolerance, correction, and silence is how an institution can steer imagination without writing a single false date. Leonardo's habit of mirror writing is attested in the Codex Atlanticus folios, and scholars agree it served convenience more than conspiracy, yet the aura of secrecy persists. A code does not need to exist to be useful. Belief in one shapes behavior, funds archives, and keeps doors locked that might otherwise crumble from dust and curiosity. Raphael entered papal service under Julius II around 1508 and spent the next decade painting the stands of the Apostolic Palace, where theology, law, and philosophy parade across plaster, as if arguing in silence. The School of Athens finished about 1,511 places Plato and Aristotle at the center, yet tucked into corners are figures whose identities scholars debate, including a woman some identify as Hypatia, though no consensus exists. In the Disputa, which actually celebrates the Eucharist, Raphael arranged saints and doctors beneath a radiant host, a visual catechism for a pope defending doctrine during the Fifth Lateran Council. Infrared reflectography has revealed changes beneath these frescoes, corrections of hands and gazes that shift emphasis, but no buried acrostic has survived peer review. Still, codes surface elsewhere. In 1514, Raphael designed the cartoon for the Sistine tapestries, later woven in Brussels, and one panel of The Miraculous Draught of Fishes contains a boat with 7 men, while the Gospel of John names only a few. Whether that numerical choice is symbolic or practical, Rome guarded the finished textiles in the Vatican Pinacoteca, displaying them rarely to control image and narrative. Censorship of art took written form in the 17th century when the Congregation of the Index banned certain engravings, and Baroque painters sometimes added fig leaves after decrees on modesty. Leonardo's own Roman period overlapped with Raphael's, and Giorgio Vasari in 1550 wrote that Leonardo lost favor with the Pope after mysterious experiments with alchemy, an anecdote colored by gossip but rooted in the reality that Leo X preferred works he could see and sell. When a British team in 2007 proposed that letters painted on apostles' robes in the Last Supper form a musical score, Vatican scholars smiled politely and said nothing. A familiar pattern where silence neither confirms nor denies. In this tension between imaginative decoding and institutional discretion, the question persists. Are we reading too much into pigment or not enough into omission? In October 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of the Knights Templar, and by 1312 Pope Clement V, meeting at the Council of Vienne, dissolved the order through the bull vox in excelso, a move shaped as much by royal pressure and Templar debt ledgers as by theology. Among the confiscated assets were not only lands but archives, inventories and charters that vanished into royal and ecclesiastical repositories. A curious document surfaced much later in 2001 when the Vatican's archivist Barbara Frail publicized the Chinon Parchment, dated August 1308, which shows that Clement V secretly absolved the Templar leadership of heresy. The parchment had sat unrecognized in the apostolic archive for centuries, misfiled under the wrong notation. That single sheet proved the papacy's public condemnation and private judgment diverged, demonstrating how a narrative can be steered by what is announced versus what is archived. Leonardo lived 2 centuries after the Templars fell, yet his patrons, including the Sforza and the Medici, inherited political landscapes shaped by their disappearance and by the redistribution of their wealth. Renaissance rumors tied surviving Templars to secret bloodlines and coded art, threads Dan Brown later wove into fiction. But earlier writers, like the 17th century abbot Henri Boudon, already speculated on hidden sanctity in suppressed orders. The Vatican, for its part, released the Chinon Parchment, not to feed conspiracies, but to clarify history. Yet the delay itself invites suspicion. If one absolution lay unnoticed until the 21st century, what of other reconciliations or admissions sealed in boxes labeled only with a color stripe? Philip IV also expelled the Jews from France in 1306, a reminder that financial motives wear theological masks, and the papacy navigated that tide with bulls that alternately protected and restricted. When institutions juggled doctrine, diplomacy, and debt, documents become levers as potent as swords. The gap between what Rome prints and what Rome files is where seekers of codes pitch their tents. Some of the most persistent whispers about Mary of Magdala do not begin in Rome at all, but in the limestone hills of Provence, where, according to medieval legend, she landed after leaving Judea and spent years in a grotto at Saint Baume. Charles II of Anjou sponsored the discovery of her supposed relics at Saint Maximin in 1279, building a basilica that drew pilgrims and revenue, while Dominican chroniclers shaped the narrative to suit Capetian politics in the south of France. Rome allowed the cult to flourish, yet never issued an unmistakable dogmatic endorsement, a careful balance that preserved devotion without surrendering interpretive control. Far older sources complicate matters. Gregory the Great, preaching in 591, fused 3 women from the Gospels into one penitent figure, a decision that steered Western art and liturgy for more than a millennium until modern scholarship separated them again. Eastern Christianity never made that fusion, venerating Mary of Magdala as equal to the apostles without branding her a prostitute. That divergence shows how doctrine can fork without Rome collapsing, which undermines the argument that any single disclosure would shatter the Church. Leonardo knew France well through his final patron, Francis I, dying at Clos-Lucé in 1519 with notebooks that scattered into private hands before ending in libraries like the Ambrosiana and the British Museum. If a sketch or marginal note hinted at a Magdalene lineage, French collectors had as much chance to hide or trumpet it as Vatican clerics. Yet the narrative keeps circling back to Vatican vaults because central authority makes for a compelling stage. The pattern we can document is less a grand cover-up and more a continuous pruning. Elevate repentance, sideline authority, permit pilgrimage, resist genealogy. Such choices, repeated over centuries, create the appearance of a secret, even if no single explosive parchment exists. The real code may simply be the editorial hand that keeps returning to the same pages with a quieter brush. Leonardo's Last Supper in Santa Maria delle Grazie was painted between 1495 and 1498, already cracking a few decades later because he experimented with oil and tempera on dry plaster instead of true fresco. The figure at Christ's right, traditionally identified as John, appears youthful and delicate, which has fueled modern claims that it is Mary of Magdala. Contemporary sources, like Matteo Bandello, who saw the work unfinished, still called that figure John, and no 16th century commentator accuses Leonardo of inserting a woman among the apostles. Yet we know that copies and engravings after the painting proliferated, some altering gestures or faces, and the Dominican refectory was badly damaged by Allied bombing in 1943, leaving restorers to reconstruct pigment with photographs and fragments. Ambiguity widened. Musicologists in 2007 proposed that the placement of bread and hands forms a staff that can be read as a short melody, another example of patterns seeking in a scene dense with geometry. Rome never ruled on these theories, since the mural is in Milan and under Dominican care, but priests across Europe used prints of the scene to teach Eucharistic doctrine, not hidden marriages. Meanwhile, the Vatican's own treatises on art, from Benedict XIV in the 18th century to John Paul II's 1,999 letter to artists. Stress beauty at the service of truth, while avoiding specific directives on individual works. That cautious tone leaves room for painters to imply more than catechisms declare. When scholars point to Raphael's inclusion of Hypatia or Michelangelo's rumored anatomical drawings in the Sistine Chapel, the Holy See answers with silence or with generalities about interpretation. The pattern is consistent. Doctrinal statements stay narrow, aesthetic statements broad. If a secret about Christ's bloodline were encoded in a Renaissance masterpiece, the safest strategy for Rome would be neither to confirm nor to loudly deny, but to celebrate the artist and rotate the conversation back to faith. Access to the Apostolic Archive is granted only to credentialed researchers who can name precisely what they seek. A paradox when the most revealing files may be those whose titles were changed, or whose catalog cards never existed. Leo XIII opened the archive in 1881 as a gesture of scholarly goodwill, yet releases move pontificate by pontificate, so papers after a certain year remain closed until a pope decides otherwise, as happened in 2020 when Francis authorized study of Pius XII's wartime records. Scholars who work there describe a warren of vaulted rooms, climate-controlled cabinets, and a bureaucracy that records every folio request. The term secret once meant private, but the rebranding to apostolic in 2019 did not alter the locks. Within those stacks sit not only bulls and diplomatic dispatches, but personal diaries, trial records, and boxes of sealed envelopes that require a higher signature to touch. The Chinon Parchment about the Templars proved that a single misfiled sheet can invert centuries of assumption. Another case surfaced in 2011 when researchers found drafts showing that John XXIII considered broader ecumenical concessions than Vatican II ultimately proclaimed. None of this proves hidden bloodlines, yet it demonstrates that what the Church reveals is curated through pastoral prudence and political caution. If a document existed that tied Leonardo to a Magdalene tradition or outlined an early Christian community led by women, its danger would not be theological error alone, but the destabilizing of a narrative that has justified structures of power for 2 millennia. Institutions rarely fear ideas in isolation. They fear the domino effect in hearts and in headlines. So the archive's greatest defense may be paperwork itself, forms, requests, denials, and a calendar that delays curiosity until interest cools. That slow drip, more than censorship, keeps questions from igniting. When Pope Gregory XV created the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in 1622, he gave Rome a centralized engine to manage doctrine abroad, but another office already tended the garden at home. The Holy Office, descendant of the Roman Inquisition founded in 1542. Together they reviewed visions, private revelations, and curious manuscripts that drifted in from monasteries and missions. A nun's diary in Spain, speaking of a feminine apostolic succession, could be judged not useful for souls and shelved, while a missionary in Syria reporting Syriac fragments that honored Mary of Magdala as teacher might receive a polite thanks and a request to forward the originals. Many such texts never reappear in printed catalogs, yet references to them survive in marginalia, a clerk's note, or a bishop's annual report. The Council of Trent had already commanded bishops to license books in their dioceses, so local censorship fed into Rome's broader sieve. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, raised eyebrows for its enigmatic sayings, including a troubled final verse about making Mary male, but by the time scholars translated it in the 1950s, the Church had adjusted to academic pluralism. Quiet containment replaced bonfires. Leonardo's Codex Leicester, now owned by the Gates estate, focuses on water and geology. Yet even there, his language about Earth as a living body invites allegory. In Rome, Athanasius Kircher's museum in the 17th century displayed oddities from Egyptian obelisks to Chinese rites, proving that curiosity could exist under clerical roofs as long as Rome framed it. Codes flourish precisely in such atmospheres. When authority permits inquiry, but with invisible borders, thinkers learn to write between lines. Thus, a pattern emerges across centuries. Evaluate, excerpt, retain, restrict. It is neither a crude cover-up nor full transparency. It is governance by omission, and within those silences, the Da Vinci Code imagination plants seeds that grow faster than archivists can prune. Barbara Fraill's publication of the Chinon Parchment in 2001 reminded historians that mislabeling can hide truth in plain sight. And another example surfaced in 2012 when researchers in the Vatican Library uncovered marginal notes by the humanist Agostino Stucco arguing in 1547 that certain apocryphal traditions about Mary of Magdala should be kept from the unlearned to avoid scandal. Stucco, librarian to Paul III and a key figure at the Council of Trent, defended scriptural concord, but quietly acknowledged destabilizing texts in circulation among scholars. His comment did not prove a bloodline, only that clerics weighed the pastoral fallout of disclosure. Similar caution appears in the correspondence of Cardinal Cesare Baronio, oratorian, historian, and author of the Annales Ecclesiastici, published 1588 to 1607, who corrected Protestant claims while admitting gaps in early records. He wrote of choosing what to emphasize for edification, a principle that later archivists adopted when selecting which inventories to print in the Monumenta Germaniae Historica or the Acta Sanctorum. In France, Johann Boland and his Jesuit team compiled massive saint lives, trimming legends that lacked documentation, yet even their footnotes mention manuscripts now missing or inaccessible. Leonardo's era left parallel traces. In 1506, the Florentine Republic ordered an inventory of artworks taken by French troops, and a note records a lost Leonardo panel of a female saint with a closed book. Whether Magdalene or not, it shows how easily art can vanish into royal or ecclesiastical vaults. The Vatican museums grew from a papal collection begun by Julius II in 1506 with the Lao Cohen statue, and as the holdings expanded, so did conservation departments, skilled at radiography and reflectography. Technical insight increases, public explanation lags. If a hidden layer in a painting or palimpsest in a codex revealed a narrative Rome disliked, conservators could stabilize it and file the report under internal reference, citing the need for further study. This is not fantasy, but procedure. The system rewards discretion, and discretion creates shadows where theories thrive. During the Western Schism that began in 1378, Christendom fractured between obediences to Rome and Avignon, and rival popes issued bulls, appointed bishops, and crafted narratives to legitimize their claims. The Council of Pisa in 1409 tried to heal the rift but only produced a third claimant, so documentation from this era is doubled and sometimes tripled, with parallel letters and contradictory decrees stored in different archives. Such duplication creates fertile ground for lost or suppressed texts. If one obedience endorsed a treatise elevating Mary of Magdala's authority while another rejected it, the victor's scribes could later consign the loser's parchment to the margins or the furnace. When Martin V was elected at Constance in 1417, he ordered chancery reforms and a review of papal registers to purge redundancies. Purge does not always mean burn. It can mean refile, mislabel, or translate selectively. Leonardo's Florence, rebuilt after the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, and the fall of the Medici in 1494, lived under Savonarola's brief theocracy before the friar was executed in 1498. His bonfire of the vanities burned paintings and manuscripts deemed immoral. Although there is no evidence a Leonardo notebook fed those flames, the event shows how quickly moral panic can erase records. Rome watched that Florentine drama carefully because Alexander VI feared sermons that stirred revolt. The Archivio di Stato in Florence today preserves trial minutes of Savonarola, while Vatican volumes hold correspondence about how to handle his followers. Across Italy, the habit formed: keep copies, keep receipts, but decide later what the faithful may read. When Pius XII opened parts of the necropolis under St. Peter's in 1949, he proclaimed the probable tomb of Peter, yet his technical team quietly debated inscriptions that read Petros Aeni or Petros here. Debates stayed in Latin footnotes, while radio announcements spoke certainty. The lesson is clear. Institutions narrate with trumpet blasts, but they archive with tweezers. Codes flourish in the space between sound and silence. Michelangelo Buonarroti began the Sistine ceiling in 1508 under Julius II and worked until 1512 suspended on scaffolds that left wax drips and charcoal footprints still traceable in restoration reports from the 1980s and 1990s. Infrared and ultraviolet imaging revealed pounce marks and pentimenti where he altered limbs and faces, suggesting evolving theological emphasis as much as artistic correction. One curiosity resides in the prophet Jonah near the altar wall, whose twisting pose mirrors anatomical cross-sections of the throat and spine, fueling theories that Michelangelo embedded dissections learned from unlicensed cadavers. Contemporary letters from his friend Luigi del Riccio lament church inspectors meddling with nudity rather than message, a sign that doctrinal eyes focused on modesty more than hidden symbols. The Last Judgment added between 1536 and 1541 under Paul III drew immediate censure from the master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, who called it indecent. prompting Daniele da Volterra to paint draperies in 1565. During those debates, no one accused Michelangelo of smuggling Magdalene lore into fresco, yet the episode shows how a single complaint can trigger repainting and thereby bury initial intentions. The Vatican owns the restoration documentation, but releases only curated summaries, citing conservation ethics. Elsewhere in Rome, a lesser-known chapel in San Silvestro al Quirinale holds a fresco cycle, where a veiled woman preaches to seated men, identified in a 17th century guidebook as a sibyl, but lacking inscription. If an archivist decided to relabel her to avoid controversy, that decision would pass quietly into new guide editions without fanfare. Leonardo and Michelangelo are often framed as rivals in Vasari's lives, but their shared experience was negotiation with patrons who measured beauty against control. The more we trace official reactions to art in the 16th century, the clearer the pattern appears. Correction replaces confession. Paint over, rename, restore, restrict. Truth does not need to be denied when it can be redirected with a brushstroke and a footnote no tourist will ever read. Jesuit Athanasius Kircher built his museum in the Collegio Romano in the mid-17th century, filling cabinets with Egyptian obelisks, sketches, Chinese rites reports, and mechanical curiosities, all filtered through a mind that believed symbols across civilizations echoed a single divine grammar. His 3-volume Oedipus Aegyptiacus, published between 1652 and 1654, attempted to decode hieroglyphs as mystical theology, an error later corrected by Champollion in 1822. Yet Rome applauded Kircher because his syncretism ultimately bent toward Catholic universality. Tucked among his correspondence are letters from missionaries in Coptic and Syriac, who mention fragments where Mary of Magdala is teacher rather than penitent. Kircher catalogued them, summarized them in Latin, and moved on, never printing the full texts. This is how information can be acknowledged without being amplified. At the same time, the Holy Office monitored visionaries like Maria de Agreda, whose bilocations to New Spain in the 1620s inspired debate over female authority. Her mystical city of God was scrutinized for decades, approved, then periodically questioned, proving that even canonized mysticism lives on a leash. Leonardo, centuries earlier, had dissected corpses in hospitals of Florence and Milan, activities tolerated when useful for art but suspect when rumor tied anatomy to unorthodox philosophy. His letter to a Piero Soderini complains that envy obstructs projects, a secular echo of the clerical caution that blocked Kircher's wilder proposals. Across these episodes, Rome demonstrates a preference for containment. Permit research within walls, publish summaries that steer conclusions, file originals where only vetted scholars can read them, and only after years of requests. If a document ever flatly claimed a bloodline of Christ preserved in France or encoded in art, the pattern suggests it would be translated, footnoted, perhaps even absolved of heresy in a private parchment like Chinon, then buried under an innocuous shelf mark. The secret is procedural rather than sensational. Decisions made in committees and congregations leave paper crumbs, but the loaf is eaten in silence. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. subscribed to keep uncovering what's hidden. France guarded its own secrets long after the revolution toppled altars and thrones. In 1,793 revolutionary commissioners seized monastic libraries, moving crates of manuscripts to depots in Paris and provincial capitals. Among them were medieval Provençal texts that told of a woman disciple crossing the sea, their pages later dispersed through sales at the Bibliothèque Nationale, or disappearing into private aristocratic collections when tides turned again under Napoleon. The Concordat of 1801 restored certain church properties, but not all papers. Bishops quietly reclaimed what served diocesan identity and let the rest languish. By the time Dan Brown tapped Rennes-le-Château lore in the late 20th century, earlier French authors like Louis Charpentier and Gérard de Sède had already woven Magdalene legends with Templar remnants, yet their citations often trace back to documents no archivist can now locate. This pattern mirrors Italy, where the suppression of religious orders by the new Italian state in 1,873 transferred convent archives to government hands. Inventories made in haste, misattributed bundles, and scholars still stumble on misfiled codices in state basements. The Vatican watched these national seizures with alarm and tightened internal controls, issuing stricter borrowing rules in the early 20th century. Leonardo's own manuscripts scattered after his death in 1519, when Francesco Melzi inherited them, and his heirs later sold folios piecemeal. Pompeo Leone in Spain bound many into the Codex Atlanticus and Madrid volumes, but loose sheets vanished or resurfaced only when a collector died. Any marginal note that hinted at heterodox theology could have been lost in that shuffle without a single cleric lifting a finger. Still, the allure focuses on Rome because its continuity makes loss feel intentional. The truth may be duller and more insidious. Archives bleed through wars, sales, reforms, and reorganizations. What remains acquires disproportionate weight, and what is missing grows fangs in imagination. The Vatican is guilty of caution, of selective framing, yet chaos outside its walls has erased as much evidence as silence inside. The Roman necropolis under St. Peter's was excavated between 1940 and 1949 after work began in 1939, revealing mausoleums from the 2nd and 3rd centuries that Pius XII publicized in 1951 as evidence for Peter's tomb. Reports by archaeologists Margherita Garducci and Antonio Ferrua disagreed over inscriptions and bones, a dispute that the Vatican managed quietly by publishing selected findings while internal memos debated provenance. This episode shows how even within the Curia, scholars can clash, and how official communiques smooth edges the public never sees. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary of Magdalene's liturgical memorial to a feast, placing her on the same level as apostles in the calendar. A decision announced by the Congregation for Divine Worship, with language that called her apostle to the apostles, but avoided doctrinal statements about ordination or lineage. Leonardo's Codex Atlanticus Folio 674 contains mirror-written notes on water vortices, not secret gospels. Yet his practice of reversing script continues to tempt readers into thinking theology hides between his gears and grottos. Meanwhile, the so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife, announced by Karen King in 2012, and later demonstrated to be a modern forgery, illustrates how hungry audiences can be for documents that confirm Dan Brown's style, narratives, and how quickly scholarly rigor can dismantle them. The Vatican, often accused of obstruction, did not need to intervene. Peer review did the pruning. In Provence, the skull venerated as Magdalene's at St. Maximin was carbon dated only partially and wrapped in medieval tradition rather than laboratory certainty. Rome tolerates that ambiguity because pilgrimage fuels piety and economy without forcing doctrine to bend. In each of these cases, facts are layered like fresco plaster. First coat, second coat, final glaze. Remove one, and colors shift. The institution knows this and therefore prefers to retouch rather than scrape to the brick. The question for us is whether patience and open archives can ever peel back enough to show the original sketch beneath. When Pope Pius IX convened the First Vatican Council in 1869, the bishops defined papal infallibility in Pastor Aeternus on 18 July 1870, just as Italian troops prepared to seize Rome. The council adjourned abruptly without finishing its schema on scripture and tradition, leaving drafts in the archives that reveal proposed language about revelation far broader than what finally reached the faithful. Those drafts, studied by historians like Klaus Schatz, show that theological nuance can evaporate under canon fire and politics. After Rome fell in September 1870, the Vatican became a self-proclaimed prisoner state until the Lateran Treaty of 1929 restored temporal certainty. During those liminal decades, popes relied on paperwork more than armies. Leo XIII opened the Vatican archives to scholars in 1881, yet simultaneously reinforced the Index of Prohibited Books, updated repeatedly until its formal abolition in 1966 under Paul VI. Even then, censorship did not vanish. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, successor to the Holy Office, continued to issue monitums against authors such as Hans Kung in 1979 and John Sobrino in 2007, quiet disciplinary acts that limit which ideas circulate in seminaries. Leonardo's notebooks had by then long been dispersed, but the Church still controlled many Renaissance codices through the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana, whose Palatine and Urbino collections absorbed manuscripts from conquered duchies. Scholars must request specific shelf marks, impossible if a title has been deliberately generified or a dossier bundled under a diplomatic series number. Meanwhile, discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in 1947 and slowly published over decades, demonstrated how academic bottlenecks outside Rome can also fuel suspicion. For years, a small team held exclusive access, provoking claims of suppression that later proved exaggerated but understandable. The pattern is global. Institutions open enough to claim transparency, yet slow enough to manage interpretation breed codes in the minds of readers. The Da Vinci Code thrives because the historical record is riddled with editorial seams. Follow those seams, and you find meetings postponed, paragraphs softened, exhibits closed early. The secret is not a single vault, but a method perfected over centuries. Renaissance Rome loved spectacle as much as sanctity, and Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope who reigned from 1513 to 521 financed banquets, masks, and art commissions while draining treasuries already weakened by wars. In that climate, Raphael, Sebastiano del Piombo, and Michelangelo jostled for favor, each painting theology into marble halls that doubled as political theaters. Documents from the apostolic camera record sales of indulgences whose abuse provoked Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, a protest that shattered Western unity and forced Rome to scrutinize every printed word with new paranoia. The Lateran Council V had just ended in 1517 with decrees on preaching and censorship that anticipated Trent's stricter measures a generation later. Leonardo, who left Rome in 1516 for France under Francis I, watched that tightening from the margins. His notebooks mention optical tricks, canal designs, and anatomy, but silence on theology can itself be strategic when patrons wear tiaras. Meanwhile, lesser-known artists in Rome embedded esoteric emblems in chapels, sponsored by noble families tied to mystery-loving academies like the Accademia della Virtù. Cardinal Bembo collected antiquities and corresponded with scholars about Plato, yet he also edited Petrarch to suit moral tastes. Editing is the Rome instinct. Trim lines, adjust phrases, retain beauty, remove danger. In the Vatican Library, the Palatine manuscripts taken from Heidelberg in 1623 after the 30 Years' War were catalogued with care, yet some controversial humanist marginalia were quietly ignored in printed guides. The Church rarely burns what it can bury in cataloging systems only insiders understand. This is why conspiracies find fertile ground. The facts show committees, councils, archives, and art all converging in a city that treats memory like stained glass. Let light through, but only colored by chosen panes. If Leonardo hinted at a truth Rome disliked, the record would show not a bonfire but a purchase order, a locked drawer, and a curator's shrug. Pope Pius XII authorized limited access to the necropolis excavations in the 1940s, but he also created the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology to centralize control over Christian burials and inscriptions across Italy, a move that kept interpretive authority in Roman hands. Decades later, John Paul II, in 1998, instituted the Pontifical Commission for the Cultural Heritage of the Church, folding it into the Congregation for the Clergy in 2012. Another administrative shuffle that affected who could see what and when. Administrative reshaping sounds dull, yet each merger or suppression of an office alters paper trails and approval chains. Scholars who wish to test relics, photograph palimpsests, or publish contentious marginalia must navigate offices whose names and competencies change faster than printed directories. In 2016, the Congregation for Divine Worship issued the decree elevating Mary of Magdalene's feast, signed by Cardinal Robert Serra and Archbishop Arthur Roche, entitled Apostolorum Apostola. Its language carefully honored her proclamation of the resurrection, without touching sacramental succession. That precision mirrors earlier moments, such as 1960, when John XXIII removed the word penitens from the Roman missals collect for her, a quiet correction of Gregory the Great's conflation. Leonardo's final years at Classe Luce under Francis I produced no dated theological notes, yet his pupil, Francesco Melzi, gathered the papers, and later the sculptor Pompeo Leoni dismembered notebooks to bind spectacular folios for Spanish collectors, a practice that destroyed context and may have lost sheets forever. Meanwhile, the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana digitizes manuscripts through collaborations like the Polanski Foundation project, begun in 2012, giving global eyes to pages once locked. But diplomatic series and personal files remain offline. Transparency is partial by design. Every release builds trust while reminding us that unseen shelves still exist. Thus, the central question hardens. Is there a single explosive document, or a centuries-long accumulation of editorial nudges that redirected Christian memory away from a woman's authority? The evidence points to the latter. The code is an accretion of small choices, each dated, signed, and rarely confessed aloud. Cardinal Cesare Baronio's Annales Ecclesiastici, published from 1588 to 1607, set a standard for Catholic historiography by answering Protestant timelines with meticulously cited documents. Yet even he admitted in prefaces that selection was unavoidable and that edification guided emphasis. His contemporary, the Oratorian scholar Antonio Gallonio, chronicled martyrdoms in lurid detail, shaping piety through chosen gore while leaving quieter disputes over women's ministries in footnote shadows. Move forward to the 19th century, and you find Johann Adam Moeller and John Henry Newman wrestling with doctrinal development, arguing that truth can unfold without contradiction, an idea Rome cautiously accepted at Vatican I, but policed carefully, lest unfolding imply reversal. Each theological generation thus inherits a file cabinet labeled pending. Leonardo never wrote a theology of development, but his iterative sketches hands redrawn, compositions reversed resemble that process. Truth by approximation, line over line. In 1943, the Holy Office quietly censured the French priest Louis Massignon for proposing that Islam held a providential role parallel to Mary's fiat, a daring inclusivity trimmed to preserve boundaries. The document exists, but only specialists cite it. Likewise, when Hans Urs von Balthasar in the 1980s lauded feminine dimensions of the Church, Rome praised the poetry while steering clear of juridical consequences. Mary of Magdala's promotion to feast rank in 2016 fits this pattern. Symbol elevated, structure untouched. Meanwhile, archives reveal how routine it is to misplace provenance. In 1998, a scholar found a 15th century vernacular gospel harmony in a diocesan attic in Umbria, its marginal note claiming descent from a lost Libro di Maddalena. The Vatican offered conservation funds. The diocese accepted, and the codex moved to Rome for temporary restoration. 2 decades later, it has not reappeared in public catalogs, though diocesan records show a receipt. Nothing illegal, everything procedural. That is the genius of institutional memory management. No flames, no denials, only delays. In that fog of paperwork, the idea of a Da Vinci Code breathes, because every postponed return feels like a locked door behind which a different Christianity waits. Freemasonry's rise in the 18th century unnerved Rome enough that Clement XII issued In Eminenti Apostolatus Specula in 1738, condemning lodges for secrecy and oaths. Then Benedict XIV reaffirmed the ban in 1751. Papal fear centered on parallel networks of allegiance that bypassed episcopal supervision, yet the fascination was mutual. Some Catholic nobles sat in lodges that traded in allegory, geometry, and veiled references to Solomon's temple, imagery that overlaps with Renaissance obsessions Leonardo shared for proportion and hidden order. In 1814, Pius VII restored the Jesuits after their suppression in 1773, partly to deploy them against such clandestine societies, a tactical move that put skilled educators back in pulpits and classrooms where symbols could be reinterpreted safely. Rumors that these fraternities guarded Magdalene bloodlines or Templar archives proliferated in French pamphlets of the 19th century, sources later mined by Gérard de Sède in the 1960s, and reworked into popular narratives about Rennes-le-Château. Vatican responses rarely named these books, preferring general cautions against superstition in papal allocutions, like Leo XIII's Humanum Genus in 1884, which cast the conflict as one between divine and naturalism without unpacking specific legends. Inside the Apostolic Archive, dossiers on Masonic activity sit under diplomatic series because popes tracked political influence more than esoteric doctrine. But scholars who have seen those files report police reports and lodge membership lists, not gospels in cipher. Still, coded drawings surface in unexpected places. An 18th century choir book in a Roman seminary holds ornate initials that, when mirrored, spell out Magdalene in Latin, a flourish a calligrapher could have included for devotion or mischief. The rector sent the volume to the Vatican Library in 1903 for rebinding, and it returned with trimmed margins, a conservation choice that erased some letters. Innocent intent can mutilate evidence as surely as malice. Thus every cut, every rebinding, every condemnation builds the mosaic. The picture viewers assemble depends on which tesserae survived the broom. Caravaggio painted more than one Magdalene. His Penitent Magdalene, around 1594, shows a young woman seated low, jewelry discarded, tears implied rather than shown, a realism that unsettled patrons used to idealize saints. Another canvas, the Conversion of Mary Magdalene, now lost but described in early inventories, placed her beside Martha in a domestic interior lit like a confession booth. Roman clergy accepted these works because they reinforced repentance, not authority. Yet Caravaggio's patrons included Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, a man who collected scientific instruments and hosted intellectual salons where Galileo once demonstrated a telescope. Art, science, and guarded theology mingled over wine, and scribes took notes later filed in family archives that Vatican librarians sometimes purchased or received as legacies. In 1907, the Congregation of the Holy Office condemned modernism in Pascendi Dominici Gregis, warning against reinterpreting dogma through historical criticism. That encyclical chilled Catholic scholarship for decades, pushing some researchers to veil their findings in cautious Latin footnotes. When Marcel Lefebvre split in the 1970s over liturgical reforms, His followers circulated pamphlets claiming Rome hid pre-Vatican II truths, mirroring in reverse the claim that Rome hides earlier Gospels. Both sides accuse the center of concealment. Leonardo's own drawings of turbulence and knots suggest an artist fascinated by patterns that repeat at different scales. Historians see the same thing in church governance. Small acts of redaction in the 16th century echo in public suspicion 4 centuries later. Consider the case of the pseudo-Isidorian decretals in the 9th century, forged papal letters that expanded episcopal rights. Rome eventually absorbed them without ever formally canonizing the fraud, proof that paperwork can mutate authority silently. If forgeries can inflate power, omission can protect it. So, whether the secret about Mary is a parchment or a practice, the mechanism is identical. Selection, correction, preservation, and long memory. The truth may sit in a drawer, or it may float in the habits of men who decide what reaches the pulpit. When Pope Urban VIII reigned from 1623 to 1644, he patronized Bernini and censored Galileo, a pairing that shows Rome could exalt beauty while muzzling dissent. Urban's Barberini bees swarmed across altars and fountains, even as his nephews managed the Holy Office files that kept unorthodox manuscripts from print. In 1633, the same year Galileo abjured before inquisitors, Athanasius Kircher arrived in Rome, soon to become the Collegio Romano's encyclopedic mind. Kircher exchanged letters with missionaries who shipped Coptic codices and Syriac scrolls, some mentioning women presiding at early Christian meals. He catalogued them, summarized them, and placed them in cabinets whose contents today are partly in the Vatican Library's Borgian collection. None of these texts proclaim a marriage of Jesus, yet their vocabulary of authority unsettled later dogmatists. Leonardo, centuries earlier, had relied on patrons for access and protection. Francis I of France gave him a manor. Urbino's Duke Guidobaldo protected Raphael. Patrons decided what survived by paying for copies, frames, bindings, and restorations. When a 17th century restorer scraped a face or a marginal note to freshen a painting or page, the past was altered with a knife, not a decree. In 1896, the Berlin Codex, containing the Gospel of Mary, was bought from an Egyptian dealer and sat untranslated for decades. The Vatican did not own it, yet its slow publication in 1955 gave critics ammunition to claim Rome stalled. Delay elsewhere still stains Rome. The pattern is clear. Art, archives, and authority intersect in choices made by individuals whose signatures hide in back rooms. We are chasing not a singular conspiracy, but a culture of curation that has steered Christian memory away from dangerous possibilities. If a Da Vinci Code exists, it is not merely pigment arranged as cipher. It is the long arithmetic of edits, sales, rebinding, cautious decrees, and strategic silences. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran beginning in 1947, revealed Hebrew and Aramaic texts from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century after, including sectarian rules that elevated communal meals and hinted at alternative priesthoods. None mention Mary of Magdala, yet their slow publication by a small international team until the early 1990s created a template for suspicion that Rome easily fit into. even though the scrolls were under Israeli and Dominican custody, not papal. In contrast, the Nag Hammadi codices found in Egypt in 1945 contained the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, and others that complicate early Christian diversity. The Gospel of Philip's reference to a companion named Mary, whom Jesus loved more than the others, most likely means spiritual intimacy, yet popular writers have stretched it to imply marriage. The Vatican issued no formal condemnation because academic journals buried the most technical debates behind Greek and Coptic footnotes. Leonardo died in 1519, long before these finds, but his fascination with proportion and hidden mechanics makes him a convenient bridge for storytellers who want a code that ties antiquity to Renaissance brushwork. Meanwhile, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, founded by Leo XIII in 1902, issued cautious responses on scriptural questions, such as the historicity of the first chapters of Genesis in 1909, and the authorship of the fourth Gospel in 1907, demonstrating how Rome drip-feeds interpretive freedom while guarding central dogmas. In 1993, the same commission under Joseph Ratzinger acknowledged the legitimacy of diverse exegetical methods, a move toward openness that still kept doctrinal boundaries intact. The pattern repeats. Discoveries emerge. Scholars argue. Rome comments lightly or not at all, preferring to let time and academic fatigue cool controversy. If a parchment existed marrying Jesus to anyone, its authentication would require carbon dating, spectrographic ink analysis, and provenance, steps that leave traces in lab logs and funding records. No such trail has surfaced. What we do see are centuries of curated emphases that keep female authority at the edges. That mosaic, assembled over time, is more plausible than a single vault with a crimson seal. Rennes-le-Château entered popular imagination when Abbé Béranger Saunière, parish priest from 1885 to 1917, suddenly spent lavishly on renovations and gardens, prompting rumors he had found parchments in a hollow pillar of his church. Archival research shows his wealth came largely from illicit mass stipends, documented in diocesan trials after his death. Yet writers like Gérard de Sade, in 1967 transformed bookkeeping fraud into treasure and Magdalene bloodline lore. Pierre Plantard then forged documents in the 1960s claiming descent from Merovingians and linked them to a priory of Sion, an organization founded only in 1956, exposed in French courts in 1993. None of this touches the Vatican directly, yet every forged pedigree invokes Rome as the antagonist that suppressed truth. The Holy See rarely dignified these tales with comment, trusting time and legal records to collapse them. Still, a pattern emerges. False papers rely on the aura of real archives. They mimic seals, Latin phrasing, and catalog numbers to borrow credibility from institutions they accuse. Leonardo is dragged into this nexus because his notebooks and paintings already look like puzzles, and his patrons connect Italy with France, where these myths breed. When Pope Benedict XVI in 2012 visited the Synagogue of Rome and referenced shared roots of faith, commentators asked why Rome could not be as open about Magdalene traditions. The comparison is strained but revealing. Openness is selective and slow. Rome chooses dialogues that strengthen current pastoral aims. A confession about a silenced female apostle could unsettle clerical structures more than ecumenical gestures do. Thus, the Church lets fringe theories burn themselves out while quietly adjusting liturgical texts, as in 2016, to grant Magdalene honor without granting her jurisdiction. The code seekers see capitulation. The curious sees housekeeping. Between those readings, the story of Rennes-le-Château continues to feed novels and films, proof that a good mystery will outrun any diocesan ledger. In the Basilica of Saint Maximin la Sainte-Baume, the skull venerated as Mary Magdalene's rests in a gilded reliquary shown each July, its jaw wired, and a glass mask covering bone. Scientific scrutiny has been sporadic. In 1974, a French team proposed radiocarbon testing, but halted after diocesan hesitation and the need for Vatican approval to sample relics recognized by Rome. Canon law does not forbid analysis, yet the Congregation for the Causes of Saints insists on preserving integrity, and bishops worry that a negative result would deflate centuries of devotion. Comparable tensions surfaced in 1988 when the Holy See authorized carbon dating of the Shroud of Turin, only to see conflicting interpretations fuel more controversy. A cautionary tale for any relic tied to Magdalene. DNA extraction from ancient bone requires destructive sampling and comparative material, neither ethically nor practically simple. Without a verified genealogical target, the test would answer little, yet news headlines would still claim verdicts. In Jerusalem's Talpiot tomb controversy of 2007, documentary producers asserted a Jesus family burial based on inscriptions and mitochondrial DNA, claims archaeologists like Amos Kloner and epigraphers quickly disputed. Rome barely needed to respond. Scholarly consensus dismantled the premise. Leonardo's era knew nothing of genetics, but Renaissance collectors guarded relics as fiercely as popes did. Isabella d'Este catalogued hair strands of saints and kings. If any hidden reliquary linked to Magdalene sat in a Vatican vault, inventories from the 17th century would likely note it. Researchers who have combed those lists find plenty of fragmentary bones labeled generically Sancta, Femina, or Maria, but attribution drifted over centuries as labels faded. Thus, relic identity is a palimpsest, much like manuscripts. The institutional instinct is to avoid tests that produce ambiguous data, which tabloids flatten into certainty. Silence becomes a pastoral strategy. Better to let the faithful kiss glass and imagine holiness than to spark debates over collagen degradation curves. Gregorian chant looks simple on parchment, neumes drifting over 4 lines without bar divisions, yet its mathematics run deep. Medieval theorists like Guido of Arezzo in the 11th century organized scales with monochord ratios, and later composers in the 13th century at Notre Dame shaped rhythmic modes that hinted at numerical patterning long before Fibonacci numbers were popularized in Europe by Leonardo of Pisa around 1202. Modern analysts sometimes map chant phrases onto golden ratios and claim hidden messages, but primary sources such as the Liber Usualis compiled by Solesma's monks in the late 19th century show an aim toward prayerful symmetry rather than cipher. Still, the Vatican's role in chant revival shows how sound can be curated like text. Pius X, in his 1903 motu proprio Trale Sollecitudini, mandated Gregorian chant as normative for worship, elevating a sonic past to counter modernism. If someone embedded acrostics in illuminated antiphonarides, the congregation of rites would never notice unless the text strayed from approved Latin. A Roman seminary choir book from the 18th century, with mirrored initials that spell Magdalene, reported by a musicologist in 1998, was rebound in the Vatican bindery and returned with margins trimmed. Conservation can erase as surely as censorship, a detail noted in many codicology reports where outer glosses are lost. Leonardo's musical sketches are scarce, but he designed instruments for court entertainments and wrote that music perishes as soon as it is born, unlike painting which remains. That belief makes him an unlikely conspirator in sonic codes meant to endure. Yet pattern seekers persist because music feels like a perfect hiding place. It flows through liturgy without suspicion. Rome issues instruction on chant authenticity, not on secret alphabets sung at matins. In truth, the most potent code in sacred music is repetition. Chant trains memory by endless cycles, teaching the faithful what to feel. That liturgical muscle crowds out alternative stories without a single barred door. Sound shapes belief more subtly than sealed archives ever could. The Codex Atlanticus, assembled by Pompeo Leone around 1590 from scattered Leonardo papers, spans dates from 1478 to 1519, and sits today in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan. Its folios rotated through display, while the bulk remains in climate-controlled drawers. Scholars like Carlo Pedretti cataloged thousands of entries, none containing overt theology, yet the very act of dismembering original notebooks severed context that might have linked a sketch to a note now lost. Another trove, the Madrid Codices I and II, surfaced only in 1964 in the Biblioteca Nacional de España after lying miscatalogued for centuries, a reminder that important sheets can hide in plain sight without Vatican intervention. Meanwhile, the Vatican Library's own collections, such as the Urbino manuscripts, taken by Alexander VII in 1657, reveal marginalia, where humanists mused on women in early Christianity, comments later trimmed in printed editions. In 2019, the Apostolic Archive opened Pius XII's files to researchers, producing debates over his wartime silence within months. Proof that once doors open, controversies multiply. The Church knows this and staggers releases deliberately. At the same time, digital projects like DigiVat.lib put high-resolution images of illuminated manuscripts online, encouraging transparency in areas deemed safe, while keeping diplomatic and doctrinal files offline. This dual strategy feeds the code narrative: openness in art, opacity in policy. Leonardo wrote that experience is the mother of all certainty, yet his heirs relied on patrons to preserve that experience. If a single sheet recorded a conversation with a Roman prelate about Magdalene texts, its survival would depend on a chain of custody as fragile as silk. We are left, therefore, with probabilities. Documents misfiled like the Chinon Parchment can flip assumptions. Others vanish in wars, sales, restorations. The Vatican's sin is less likely concealment of a marriage contract than centuries of shaping which questions feel worth asking. That is the quietest code of all, the curriculum of curiosity set by those who guard the shelves. John Paul II's pontificate, 1978-2005, produced a torrent of documents, among them the 1988 Apostolic Letter, Mulieris Dignitatem, which elevated the dignity of women yet anchored priestly authority in an all-Wale apostolic college. Simultaneously, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, under Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, issued the 1994 responsum, stating definitively that the Church has no authority to ordain women, closing theological debate with a claim to irreformable teaching. These paired texts exemplify Rome's two-handed method: praise the feminine, barricade the sanctuary. In archives, minutes from the 1976 Pontifical Biblical Commission show a majority of theologians judge there is no clear scriptural bar to women's ordination, but Paul VI declined to act on that vote. The report exists and is cited, yet magisterial weight ignored its conclusion. Leonardo's era contains a parallel dynamic. His patrons admired his intellect, but curtailed his oddities. Pope Leo X reportedly grew impatient with his experiments because they yielded no immediate spectacle. A benign dismissal can bury a radical mind as effectively as a gag order. In 2007, Benedict XVI erected the Pontifical Commission Ecclesiae into a permanent body to reconcile traditionalist groups, proving Rome can flex for dissenters whose issue is liturgy, while remaining ironclad against those who press women's authority. That asymmetry is instructive. The Church negotiates where structure is safe, resists where pillars might crack. Meanwhile, scholars continue to find medieval marginal glosses that mention women preaching in domestic liturgies, texts Rome can wave away as disciplinary anomalies. The code hunters call this evasion. Curial officials call it prudence. Between those labels, an invisible curriculum operates. Teach Catholics to revere Magdalene's love, never to imitate her leadership. Leonardo's supposed secrets attract attention because they promise a shortcut past that curriculum, a master key in paint. Yet the real locks are in canon law, not canvas, and those were forged across councils and encyclicals most viewers never read. The Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, opened archives of possibility even as it closed others. De Verbum, promulgated in 1965, embraced historical critical methods for Scripture, inviting scholarship yet insisting tradition and magisterium remain judges. In the Council's preparatory schemas, early drafts show bolder language about revelation as dialogue, later softened in final votes. Those drafts rest in the Vatican's conciliar archive, consulted by historians but seldom preached from pulpits. After the Council, the 1968 Motu Proprio Integrae Servandi reformed the Holy Office into the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, shifting tone from condemnation to promotion of doctrine. Yet, disciplinary letters still silenced voices. Leonardo's manuscripts underwent their own Vatican II of sorts when modern editors reassembled scattered folios, but no council restored what Leone had sliced apart. In 1000, 975, the Vatican published Inter Insigniores on women's ordination, citing Christ's example and apostolic practice. Mary of Magdala is praised as first witness, then set outside sacramental ministry. This rhetorical move echoes Gregory the Great's 6th century conflation, redefine to control. Outside Rome, the discovery of the Oxyrhynchus papyri in Egypt, late 19th century, added fragments like Logion, 114 of Thomas, where Peter opposes Mary. That text's misogyny is often weaponized to argue exclusion was early and thus immutable. Yet other fragments show women hosting assemblies. Rome can cherry-pick, just as code theorists do. In 2003, the Vatican published a document on the collaboration of men and women in the Church and world, rich in anthropology, thin on jurisdiction, selection again. Leonardo's Vitruvian Man inscribes a human form in square and circle, symbolizing harmony. The Church's own geometry is similar, a circle of praise for women, a square of law that bounds them. No single parchment can undo a diagram etched over centuries. The code, if any, is the tension between what the Council allowed scholars to see and what bishops allow laity to do. The Pontifical Biblical Commission's 1,993 document, The Interpretation of the Bible in the Church, affirmed feminist exegesis as legitimate when it uncovers voices marginalized in Scripture. Yet it immediately warned against ideological distortions that challenge doctrine. This yes-oh and no posture mirrors earlier centuries, where Kircher could catalog Coptic texts but not publish disruptive translations. In 2016, the Commission studied female diaconate history at Pope Francis's request. Their 2019 report admitted women served as deacons in antiquity, but stopped short of recommending sacramental restoration. The text remains unpublished to the public, filtered through papal summaries. That opacity keeps speculation alive. Leonardo's own letters reference secrecy in workshops, guarding techniques from rivals. Knowledge held back grows legendary value. Meanwhile, the Gospel of Mary fragments from Berlin are now digitized, accessible to anyone with a browser. Ironically, secular institutions display what Rome is accused of hiding. Yet belief gravitates to Rome because it owns continuity. Consider the Pius XII archives opened in March 2020. Within days, scholars like David Kurtzer found memos revealing complex Vatican diplomacy with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Transparency birthed controversy instantly. Learning from that, some curial officials argue internally to time releases carefully. Slow-motion disclosure is a policy, not a glitch. The Da Vinci Code mindset reads policy as plot. There is plot, but it is the plot of institutions preserving self. In 2000, and 7 an ossuary inscribed Mariamine Mara at Talpiot stirred claims of Magdalene's tomb until epigraphers dismantled the sensationalism. Rome barely sighed. Outsiders crave a smoking gun. Insiders fear even a foggy mirror. So the Church continues to elevate Magdalene's feast while locking ordination. It quotes the Gospel of Mary in homilies, but not in canon law. Leonardo could encode an idea in a gesture. The Vatican encodes stance in decrees with footnotes that most will never chase. Both require trained eyes. One paints in sfumato, the other in Latin juridical prose. Each hides by blending. Hidden rooms exist, but they are usually prosaic. The Vatican Apostolic Archive has sealed sections for recent pontificates. The Fabbrica di San Pietro keeps engineering files on basilica maintenance, and the Swiss Guard archives hold duty rosters and security plans. None are likely to contain a marriage contract, yet history reminds us misfiled treasures happen. In 2006, a researcher in the Vatican Library stumbled on Galileo's original 1613 letter to Benedetto Castelli, revealing that the version used to condemn him had been altered. Centuries of narrative shifted with one discovery. That encourages seekers. Margherita Guarducci's work on the graffiti wall under St. Peter's produced a similar flip. Antonio Ferrua disputed her reading of Petrus Aeni, arguing alternative interpretations. The Vatican let both speak, then issued a prudent communiqué affirming confidence without anathematizing dissent. Strategy again. Leonardo lived in an Italy of walled cities and private studioli where dukes hid personal libraries. Federico da Montefeltro's Urbino Studiolo became part of the Vatican Library's urbanate collection. Shelving can be political. When Alexander VII seized the Palatine Library from Heidelberg in 1623, he reframed it as rescue from heresy. Might the same logic justify quietly acquiring a codex on Magdalene? Save it from misuse, lock it for safekeeping. In Provence, relic inventors claimed discovery visions. In Rome, catalog clerks recorded acquisitions in crabbed Latin. Between vision and ledger lies the gray room where myths ferment. Modern restorers with multispectral imaging can expose palimpsests, as with the Archimedes palimpsest in 1998. If a Magdalene text underlies a medieval homily, technology could find it. Yet access to many Vatican manuscripts for such imaging is scarce. Conservation, cost, and control form the triad of delay. Thus, we return to method. The Church hides by slowing. Leonardo hid by reversing. The faithful hide by mythologizing. Everyone hides something, even if only from themselves. Gregory the Great's homily 33 on the Gospels, preached around 591, merged 3 women into one Magdalene. That sermon's Latin spread through medieval homiliaries and fixed Western imagination. Rome has never issued a dogmatic statement teaching Magdalene was a prostitute, yet Gregory's authority functioned as de facto doctrine for a millennium. In 1969, the Roman Missal quietly removed penitents from her collect. In 2016, her feast rose. 2 edits in 50 years untied a knot centuries old. This illustrates how the Church corrects without confessing error. It simply changes the text and moves on. Leonardo's corrections were visibly erasures and redraws but his final canvases conceal the struggle. The Vatican's strategy is the reverse. Public liturgy shows the brushstrokes. Archives hide the sketch. The Council of Trent's decree on the index in 1563 ordered bishops to hunt suspect books. Lists swelled, peaked in the 19th century, then died in 1966. Yet internal vetting persists. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's Notificatio against Sister Margaret Farley's Just Love in 2012 shows modern policing of sexual theology. If a theologian argued Magdalene's marital status altered ecclesial authority, expect a quiet letter, not a public pyre. The code hunters seek fireworks. Rome prefers paperwork. Meanwhile, textual criticism shows John 20, naming Magdalene as first witness, a fact proclaimed in papal homilies on Easter. Authority praises her role when it serves resurrection proclamation, then sidelines her when structure is discussed. This toggling is the true cipher. Leonardo's Last Supper has no chalice at Christ's hand, an omission debated by art historians. The Church ignored it liturgically because doctrine does not hang on a cup in Milan. It hangs on councils. Thus, any hidden meaning in art is secondary to visible legislation. To crack the Vatican's code, read the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, not the frescoes. Still, stories need images, and so the Da Vinci myth will outlive any footnote correcting it. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. In 2005, the newly elected Benedict XVI addressed the Roman Curia and spoke of a hermeneutic of reform versus a hermeneutic of rupture, arguing Vatican II must be read in continuity. That phrase has governed curial decisions since, including how to present changes regarding women. Continuity is the watchword that justifies incremental shifts without acknowledging paradigm breaks. Leonardo's sfumato likewise creates continuity between light and shadow, softening edges. In 2018, Francis created a second commission to study women deacons after the first produced no consensus. Its findings remain unpublished, discussed behind closed doors with the International Union of Superiors General. Process replaces proclamation. The secret is procedural inertia. Meanwhile, the 2012 forgery of the so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife proved how eager both media and some scholars are to find a document confirming marriage. When Harvard Theological Review delayed publication pending tests, the Vatican press office said nothing. It did not need to. Exposure by papyrologists like Christian Askeland and line-by-line linguistic analysis demolished the fragment. Rome's most effective defense is often patience. In art history, debates over whether Salai, Leonardo's student, posed as John or the Mona Lisa entertain, but they do not alter sacraments. The Vatican knows which battles risk dogma. As for relics, the Congregation for Divine Worship's 2017 instruction forbids displaying relics of doubtful authenticity publicly, a clause that could quietly remove contested items without scandal. Thus, regulation does the hiding. The code narrative thrives when policies are dull and files are dense. No one writes thrillers about committee minutes, yet that is where truths hide. Leonardo sketched machines of war for Cesare Borgia. He also designed theater props. The Vatican likewise arms, doctrine, and stages devotion. Both crafts require backstage crews unseen by the audience. To see the code, one must walk behind the curtain, and those corridors are patrolled not by assassins but by archivists with forms to sign. Athanasius Kircher's correspondence reveals he received Syriac manuscripts from Mar Michael, a Maronite monk, in the 1640s. Among them were homilies by Jacob of Saru praising women at the tomb. Kircher excerpted lines in Latin, but never printed the full Syriac. His Latin selection framed the text as poetic flourish, not ecclesial precedent. That editorial act is a microcosm of Rome's larger habit. Translate selectively. In 1900, Pope Leo XIII published Orientalium Dignitas to protect Eastern rites, yet Latin discipline continued to overshadow them. Eastern churches ordained women as deacons into the medieval period, a fact documented in the Barberini Eucologion, 8th century, housed in the Vatican Library, Vata Barberini GR, 336. The rite's existence is undeniable. Rome explains it as non-sacramental or culturally bound. Definitions shift to preserve structure. Leonardo's notebooks show how definitions can shift lines. A sketch labeled for a canal becomes a study in perspective when context goes missing. In 2019, scholars accessing Pius XII's files found drafts of speeches that softened language about Jews after advisors warned of diplomatic fallout. The Pope's final addresses reflect that editing. Again, diplomacy edits theology. The Da Vinci Code hypothesis imagines a single vault labeled truth. Reality offers drawers labeled pending translation. Not for publication, for bishops only. When Pope Paul V founded the Archivum Secretum in 1612, secret meant personal, not nefarious. Yet the semantic drift of secret feeds suspicion. Francis's rename to Apostolic Archive failed to erase it. People believe in vaults because vaults fit narrative instincts. But the more insidious hiding place is the footnote omitted, the appendix unpublished, the rite redefined. Leonardo hid by illusion, Rome by institution. Both leave clues. Pentimenti under paint, redacted lines in protocols. If we follow them with patience, we map a culture of containment rather than a conspiracy of shock. The Magdalene truth is less likely a bomb and more a slow burn that has already warmed the room unnoticed. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio killed Ranuccio Tomasoni in 1606 and fled Rome under sentence of death. His patrons continued to commission works in exile, including altarpieces for Maltese and Neapolitan churches. The Church can forgive a murderer's art while disciplining a theologian's footnote. That disparity reveals priorities. Visual shock can be baptized if it preaches repentance. Textual subversion unsettles law. In 1989, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a notification on Leonardo Boff, silencing his liberation theology writings. The document cites confusion of faithful, the same reason used centuries earlier to restrict apocryphal texts. Meanwhile, in 2007, the Vatican Museums opened a new storage facility, the Deposito, where thousands of artworks rest unseen for conservation. Curators decide what the public sees. Selections build doctrine visually. Leonardo's works hang mostly outside Vatican walls, but the Holy See owns significant collections of minor Renaissance painters who echoed major themes. Control can be indirect. In 2012, an Italian team used multispectral imaging on the Codex Vaticanus B, discovering palimpsested notations. Technology is cracking silence, yet access to machines is limited by budgets and permissions. The Church funds what it wants found. Private foundations fund the rest. Each grant application is a gate. In Provence, the annual procession of Magdalene's skull continues, uninterrupted by scholarship. Devotion outvotes data. Rome lets it run, perhaps recalling Tertullian's line, "The blood of martyrs is seed. Pilgrim money is seed too." The code thus may be economic, control revenue streams, control narratives. Leonardo's patrons bought discretion. The Vatican's donors expect orthodoxy. Everyone pays to play. The Magdalene we meet tonight sits at the crossroads of economy, liturgy, and imagination. Her story is a ledger entry and a love song. The Church sings the love, hides the ledger. Hans Küng lost his Missio Canonica in 1979 for challenging papal infallibility, yet he remained a priest and professor, publishing widely. Rome's censure was surgical: remove authority, leave voice, betting the faithful read magisterium more than monographs. This tactic echoes earlier centuries when suspect theologians were reassigned rather than burned. Silence by relocation. In 2001, the Vatican issued the Motu Proprio Sacramentorum Sanctitatis Tutela, centralizing jurisdiction over graviora delicta, including grave liturgical abuses and heresy, under the CDF. Consolidation means fewer leaks. Leonardo's notes on optics reside in institutions that can publish freely. Rome's doctrinal files remain under oath. In 2020, researchers in the newly opened Pius XII archives found Cardinal Tardini's memo advising careful language toward the deportation of Rome's Jews in 1943, a humane impulse filtered through caution. The memo lay folded for decades. Paper does not burn itself. It waits for eyes. The code narrative depends on waiting. Every unopened box proves its point. Yet many boxes hold dullness: invoices, seating charts, weathered sermons. The single explosive page, if it exists, could be embedded there, but odds favor bureaucracy. Magdalene's elevation in 2016 came via a brief decree, not a theological treatise. That brevity conceals deliberations detailed in meeting minutes we cannot read. Leonardo's brevity cryptic notes, single words fuels fantasy too. Sparse text invites projection. The Vatican banks on that. Let imagination run in novels while discipline stands firm in canon law. Thus, truth becomes bifurcated. One for art and bedtime stories, one for juridical acts. The code is the gap between them. Close the gap, and scandal erupts. Keep it, and mystery pays the bills and fills the pews. The Shroud of Turin test in 1988 dated the cloth to the 14th century, stunning devotees. Cardinal Anastasio Ballesteros accepted the result publicly, yet debates continue over sample contamination. Rome allowed science, absorbed shock, then let uncertainty blur edges. That playbook would apply to any Magdalene relic test. Authorize cautiously, interpret pastorally, never let data dictate dogma. In 2014, Pope Francis established the Secretariat for the Economy, bringing financial transparency rhetoric to the Curia. Audits exposed accounts, yet the Institute for Works of Religion remains opaque to outsiders. Money transparency is partial. Doctrinal transparency even more so. Leonardo's patrons, like Ludovico Sforza, used pageants to distract from fiscal ruin, Popes do similar, hosting jubilees while deferring hard questions. The 2006 Da Vinci Code film prompted an Opus Dei press office blitz and a Vatican radio shrug. Officials called it fiction. Bishops warned discernment. Sales soared. Sometimes Rome exploits controversy to catechize. Magdalene's 2016 feast decree included a new preface in the Mass that calls her apostle to the apostles. Progress packaged liturgically. No mention of marriage, but a semantic nudge. The Congregation for Divine Worship's internal drafts likely considered phrasing. Those drafts are the code, words weighed, verbs swapped. Archivists will file them. Scholars will one day read them and write the microhistory of a comma. Leonardo's sfumato hides edges in smoke. Curial Latin hides shifts in subordinate clauses. To decode, you need grammar more than grids. You need patience more than passion. The Vatican relies on our exhaustion. Lengthy processes deter hunters. But here we are, paragraph 39, still digging. That persistence is what any buried truth fears. Whether we find a parchment or only a pattern, the act of looking redraws power. Eastern Orthodox tradition celebrates Mary Magdalene as equal to the apostles, reflecting a memory unshaped by Gregory's conflation. Their liturgical texts, preserved in Slavonic and Greek typica, never sexualize her. Rome's gradual convergence with Eastern honor in 2016 highlights how divergent memory can be reconciled without admission of fault. The Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church has produced documents like the 2007 Ravenna Statement on synodality and primacy, yet none tackle Magdalene directly. Still, ecumenism introduces pressure. When Catholics see Orthodox chant Magdalene's authority, questions arise. The Curia answers by elevating feast rank but holds ordination. Leonardo's world included Greek émigrés fleeing Constantinople after 1453, bringing texts west. Cardinal Bessarion donated his Greek library to Venice in 1468. Greek manuscripts in the Vatican arrived similarly. Translation choices then shaped Western theology. If a scribe downplayed a passage on Magdalene, that edit echoes. In 2021, Francis named women to membership in the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life, a small structural move. He instituted the lay ministries of lector and acolyte for women in 2021 by motu proprio Spiritus Domini and catechist in Antiquum Ministerium, yet kept holy orders male. Incrementalism again. Archives record debates over those motu proprios. Future historians will map which cardinals resisted which verbs. The code is not which painting holds Mary, it is which canon paragraph omits her. The faithful seldom read Canon 1024, only a baptized male validly receives sacred ordination. That is the iron bar. Leonardo's brush cannot bend it, but documents can. A future pope could rewrite that canon. Until then, Rome preserves beauty and edits power. Magdalene is displayed, not enthroned. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. Digital humanities bring new light. Projects like the Vatican Library's palimpsest program and the Bodleian's initiatives apply multispectral imaging to reveal erased texts. In 2017, scholars uncovered Galen's lost medical treatises under Christian hymns. If a Magdalene discourse hides beneath a homily, technology can find it, but permission and funding gatekeep. The Holy See partners with institutions on safe material patristic sermons, classics while sensitive ecclesial files await. Leonardo's Codex Arundel is online, inviting armchair analysts to hunt for ciphers. Democratized access democratizes speculation. In 2020, the pandemic closed the Apostolic Archive reading rooms, slowing research just as Pius XII files opened. Delay by force majeure served as accidental secrecy. Archivists triaged requests. Priorities shaped narratives. Meanwhile, the 2019 Amazon Synod raised female diaconate again. Final documents asked for continued study. Rome postponed. Time is Rome's ally. The code thrives on delay. It whispers, what are they hiding? Often, nothing but drafts. Yet drafts matter. They show alternatives almost chosen. In 1950, Pius XII defined the Assumption ex cathedra. Drafts show debate on language about death. Such nuances rarely reach pews. They reach archives. Leonardo supposedly said, "Art is never finished, only abandoned. The Church never finishes doctrine, only proclaims what it dares and shelves what it fears." Mary of Magdala's full story may already sit in plain sight, scattered across liturgy, art, and apocrypha. Rome's silence stitches the pieces together by omission. Our task is not to find a singular manuscript, but to read the seamwork. That is slower, less cinematic, but true. Financial archives tell their own tale. The Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for Works of Religion, IOR, was implicated in scandals like Banco Ambrosiano's collapse in 1982. Investigations revealed shell companies and secret accounts. While unrelated to Magdalene, these episodes demonstrate the Curia's capacity for concealment where money is concerned. If funds purchased manuscripts, the audit trail could be buried in coded ledgers. In 1929, the Lateran Treaty granted the Holy See a lump sum in bonds. Investment management became an art. A 1967 Apostolic Constitution, Regimini Ecclesiae Universae, reorganized the Curia, merging and suppressing offices. Each suppression risks archival displacement. Leonardo's patrons also laundered reputation through art. Cesare Borgia hired him to map Imola to prove governance. Beauty masks, brutality. Rome's basilicas proclaim splendor, while chancery files whisper compromise. When the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith investigated theologian Senior Elizabeth Johnson in 2011, the U.S. bishops criticized her book Quest for the Living God, citing ambiguous language. Again, ambiguity policed. Magdalene's ambiguity is curated by calling her apostle yet denying her apostolic succession. The financial analogy holds. Pay symbolic dividends, withhold capital. If a Da Vinci Code existed on parchment, purchasing and hiding it would require funds. The IOR could mask that, but internal reforms since 2013 created reporting lines through Moneyval. Paper trails lengthen. Secrets grow harder. The smarter play is not to buy but to influence. Support certain scholars, starve others. Archive management is cheaper than forgery. Leonardo's code was talent. The Vatican's is process. Different arts, same end. Control, narrative. Relic authentication follows canon law outlined in the 1983 Code and Norms from the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Procedures require seals, episcopal oversight, and documentation. Yet, many medieval relics, like the Holy Foreskin or multiple heads of John the Baptist, show how redundancy thrives. Magdalene's relics are no exception. Competing claims exist. Vézelay in Burgundy, Saint Maximin in Provence. The Church often lets local devotion stand unless scandal forces intervention. In 1876, Pope Pius IX declared the Vézelay relics false after inquiries, yet did not strip the basilica of honor. Damage control through nuance. Leonardo collected anatomical parts for study, drawing tendons in exquisite detail. His respect for flesh contrasts with relic veneration. The Church venerates bone. Leonardo dissected it. Two epistemologies. In 1937, Pius XI condemned racism in Mitbrennender Sorge, smuggled into Germany. The encyclical's clandestine printing shows Rome can trumpet truth when needed. Why not trumpet Magdalene's leadership? Because dogma on orders is bound up with centuries of male clerical identity. Undoing it shakes too much. Easier to elevate her feast. Archives record bishops' conferences pleading for women deacons. The responses are genre pieces. Thank you, further study. The code is the stall. Leonardo stalled commissions, leaving works unfinished. Rome leaves questions unfinished. Each century repaints the Magdalene, but the underlying drawing shows a woman first at the tomb. Rome cannot erase that, so it frames her. Frames are the Vatican's forte. The pseudo-Clementine literature from the 4th century, preserved in Greek and Latin, features debates between Peter and Simon Magus, where a woman named Helena appears. A Gnostic reworking of Magdalene echoes. The Church labeled these texts heretical, yet copied them in monasteries for refutation. Copying preserves what condemnation cannot kill. In the Vatican Library, codices like Vat GR 1120 hold such material. Access is granted, but lay readers rarely know to ask. Leonardo's marginalia often trail off mid-sentence, suggesting thoughts interrupted. Likewise, synodal discussions on women trail into further study. In 2022, Francis opened the possibility of laity voting in synods, including women. Structural cracks widen. Future archives will show who resisted. The Da Vinci Code hypothesis claims the Vatican fears truth because it would topple faith. History suggests faith survives scandal, but structures tremble. The Church endured the Cadaver Synod, Avignon Papacy, Borgia orgies, yet priesthood stayed male. Therefore, the guarded truth is not Christ's marital status, but institutional self-preservation. Leonardo's secrets threatened no throne, so he died in peace in France. Rome protects thrones, not canvases. If art hints at revolt, it is reinterpreted. If text does, it is sequestered. This dual track is the operational code. To decode, track which genres Rome lets loose. Poetry flows, policy crawls. Magdalene appears in homilies, disappears in councils. That rhythm is measurable. Count citations in L'Osservatore Romano versus Acta Apostolicae Sedis. You will see the pattern. In 2018, the International Theological Commission released Synodality in the Life and Mission of the Church, endorsed by Francis, framing governance as walking together. Yet synodality without shared jurisdiction remains consultation. Mary of Magdala walked first, spoke first, governed none. Language honors, law restrains. The 2023 Synod on Synodality included women as voting members for the first time. Minutes will enter the archive. The public sees summaries. Leonardo's studios worked similarly. Apprentices sketched, masters signed. Credit and authority diverged. Archivists know the power of metadata. Label a file devotional miscellany, and no one will request it. That is passive secrecy. In 2020, a researcher found a mislabeled folder in the Pius XII archive containing pleas from Jewish families. Mislabeling can be negligence or design. Without proof, suspicion reigns. The Vatican thrives in that fog because it controls the lamp. Leonardo's chiaroscuro's sculpted form with shadow. The Church shapes narrative with selective illumination. When Pope Francis preached on Magdalene in 2020, he praised her perseverance, but never mentioned debates on ordination. Homily as half-truth. Truth enough to inspire, not enough to destabilize. The code is pastoral calculus. Give comfort, avoid rupture. Technology tempts a crack. Artificial intelligence can sift digitized archives for patterns humans miss. If Vatican datasets go online, algorithms could spot recurring redactions around Magdalene. But the Holy See releases images, not raw OCR text, limiting machine reading. Control persists. Leonardo's drawings invite machine analysis too, but pattern overfitting looms. Sequences found may be coincidence. In 2009, the Vatican held a conference on extraterrestrial life, signaling openness to big questions. Yet women's ordination remains off the table. Selective boldness betrays priorities. The 1907 anti-modernist oath, required until 1967, trained clergy to distrust novelty. That muscle memory still twitches. Magdalene as apostle feels novel to many, despite ancient roots, so Rome couches it as poetic title. Meanwhile, diocesan archives worldwide hold parish registers, visitation records, and bishops' letters. Some mention lay women preaching in emergencies. Rome does not need to suppress what is fragmented. Diffusion hides, as well as vaults. Leonardo's heritage diffused too, housed in Windsor, Paris, Milan, Madrid. No single key opens all. The Vatican's opponents often imagine one key. That is error. A culture, not a codex, conceals. To change it, you rewrite practice, not just unveil parchment. The code seekers, if wise, will aim for canon lawyers, not curators. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here, subscribe. Pilgrimage economies anchor myths. Compostela thrives on James, Loreto on a House of Mary, Provence on Magdalene. The Vatican governs through guidelines, not bulldozers. In 1999, the Congregation for the Clergy issued an instruction on pilgrimages, focusing on catechesis, not authenticity tests. Rome shepherds devotion, rarely interrogates origin. Leonardo understood patrons' psyche. Give them marvel, they excuse your delays. Churches offer marvel. Archives swallow delay. In 2010, L'Osservatore Romano praised the Gospel of Mary film for artistic merit, while clarifying doctrine separately. 2 tracks again. In liturgy, Magdalene's proper Mass now names her first witness explicitly. Many Catholics will hear that and infer equality. Rome lets inference work, avoids decree. Archivists file drafts of that preface with names of theologians who suggested lines. Those names will matter to future scholars mapping shifts. Leonardo's name overshadows his collaborators. Rome's decisions overshadow theologians who advised. Credit hides influence. The code is hidden authorship. Find the ghostwriters of decrees. You find where change ferments. That requires access to personal papers, often donated after death with stipulations. The American College in Rome holds boxes from bishops who attended Vatican II, but sealed segments remain. More locked drawers. The conspiracy lives in the clauses of wills. Canon law codified in 1917 and revised in 1983 sets juridical logic. Canon 1024 restricts ordination. Canon 230 permits lay ministries. Word choice enshrines ideology. Changing it is the battle. Leonardo's treatise on painting, compiled posthumously by Francesco Melzi, organizes scattered thoughts into law-like aphorisms. Editors shape masters. Gratian's Decretum, in the 12th century, synthesized contradictory canons, becoming the legal backbone of the Church. He included authorities both for and against positions, teaching jurists to harmonize. That method becomes the code. Harmonize away the disruptive. In Gratian's time, women deacons are mentioned and then framed as exception. The Digest of Justinian did similar with Roman law. Tradition is curated contrast. The Apostolic Constitution Anglicanorum Coetibus in 2009 created ordinariates for Anglicans, showing Rome can craft new structures quickly when desired. No equivalent exists for Magdalene devotees. Desire is key. Archives record desire in marginal notes expediat or non-expedit. Those Latin whispers are levers. Leonardo's marginal si and no govern experiments. Church margins govern dogma. To expose code, read margins, not headlines. But margins are trimmed, ink fades, catalogs mislead. Thus, the quest persists. Media shapes perception. The 2006 release of the Da Vinci Code film drove tourists to Rosslyn Chapel and Louvre docents to script disclaimers. The Vatican's communications strategy, revamped in 2015 with the Secretariat for Communication, monitors such waves. It issues clarifications sparingly to avoid Streisand effects. Silence can starve a story or feed it. Rome gambles case by case. When National Geographic aired the Gospel of Judas in 2006, the Vatican commented minimally, letting scholars debate Gnostic theology. Magdalene narratives ride similar cycles. Leonardo's brand magnetizes them. His Mona Lisa smile becomes metaphor for hidden truth. The painting, stolen in 1911, vanished 2 years, proving masterpieces can disappear even under guard. Archives are less secure than the Louvre. Flood in 1000. 966 damaged Florence's treasures. Mud angels saved manuscripts. Disaster audits reveal what was where. If a Magdalene codex gets wet, we would know. Insurance and restoration create paper trails. Hence, the likelihood of absolute concealment shrinks. More plausible is dispersion and disinterest. The Vatican buries by boring. Make a document dull. No one reads it. The code is what we fail to ask for. Ask, and doors may open. But you must know the shelf mark. Catch 22 of secrecy. Synodal minutes from diocese worldwide feed to Rome when bishops meet. They include laity consultations. In 2023, many reported calls for women in leadership. The synthesis document acknowledged the cry, promised study. Archives will hold the raw responses. Researchers decades hence will quote them to show sensus fidelium was voiced. Whether canon law bends depends on future popes. Leonardo's oeuvre shows evolution. First attempts stiff, later fluid. Institutions evolve slower. In 1870, infallibility was defined. In 1965, collegiality affirmed. In 2018, bishops' conferences gained some authority on translations. Slowly the square widens. Magdalene's promotion from memorial to feast took 4 centuries after Gregory. That timeline discourages thrill seekers. Codes love immediacy. Rome loves apocal drip. The Holy Office protocols from 1,730 list cases of quiet corrections. Books altered, authors admonished, none public. Censorship without spectacle. Leonardo's corrections exist under paint. The Vatican's under seal. Modern democracies use freedom of information laws. The Church claims divine constitution, not public office. There is no FOIA for Peter's keys. The faithful rely on papal goodwill. That is the ultimate code. Trust. Break it, and the edifice cracks. Rome protects trust by curating shock. Magdalene's truth, if disruptive, will be rationed. Consider the case of the archivist's map of absences, a hypothetical chart theorized by some scholars. Plotting missing files against topics reveals patterns. If Magdalene, women deacons, and Leonardo correspondence cluster, suspicion rises. But absence can echo floods, fires, revolutions. The 1,527 sack of Rome by imperial troops destroyed archives. German landsknechts looted Raphael's cartoons. Chaos did more than conspiracy. Yet after chaos, catalogers rebuild with choices. Inventories favor papal diplomacy over domestic liturgy. Magdalene slips between. Leonardo slips between art and science catalogs. Shards land apart. The separate boxes narrative begins. In 2002, the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews published The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Christian Bible, acknowledging Jewish readings as valid. That boldness shows Rome can handle textual plurality. Why not open Apocrypha fully? Perhaps because Judaism is external other, Magdalene internal challenge. Identity politics shapes access. Leonardo is safe as genius, unsafe as theologian. So Rome pushes him to museums, not seminaries. The code is categorization. Define a thing as art, not doctrine, and you control its impact. Archivists choose tags. Tags choose fate. When Pope Francis in 2022 issued Predicate Evangelium, reforming the Curia, he placed the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith under a mission of service, not control, in wording. Yet, competence remains. Doctrine is policed. The reform merged councils, renamed congregations, shuffled heads. Institutional shell games affect researchers. Which office grants permission now? Confusion delays requests. Leonardo's estate experienced similar confusion when Melzi's heirs mismanaged the papers. Mismanagement masquerades as mystery. In 2017, the Vatican Observatory held a workshop on black holes, cosmic transparency, earthly opacity, choices again. Magdalene's story is earthbound, structural, harder to risk. Meanwhile, the German synodal way proposed women deacons in 2023. Rome responded with cautions, letters, meetings. Those letters will be archived. Future code breakers will quote them. This script becomes archived too. Words spoken become evidence. Rome knows this, hence cautious phrasing. Leonardo's letters got him pensions. Our letters get us footnotes. The code is temporal. Wait long enough, and files open. Impatience breeds fiction. Patience breeds history. We circle back to Provence, to skulls in glass and candles at dusk. Pilgrims do not ask for carbon dates. They ask for intercession. Rome's pastoral calculus keeps lights on. Leonardo died, embraced by a king, not a pope. His legacy traveled courts, not cathedrals. Yet his name became a bridge to Rome's secrets because novels needed a genius, and the Vatican needed a foil. In reality, the Church's secrecy is less cinematic than clerical. It is the slow red pen, the meeting adjourned, the draft not published. The Chinon Parchment proves Absolutions can sit centuries unread. The Gospel of Mary proves suppressed voices resurface from sands, not vaults. The code is not hidden in the Louvre's shadows, but in the psychology of institutions and the appetite of believers. Jesus called Mary by name in John 20 and sent her to tell the brothers. That line is scripture and unsealed. The Vatican cannot hide it. It can, however, define what telling means. Preaching at Mass. Governing. A diocese. Those definitions are where secrecy lives. Leonardo painted hands reaching, bread breaking. We project secrets there, because the real battlefield canon clauses and congregational menites dull. Tonight we have walked the dull halls and found drama in footnotes. The truth behind the Da Vinci Code is procedural power. Why keep silent if silence breeds suspicion? Because certainty maintains structures longer than transparency does. The Vatican guards unity, treasury, and sacramental order with methods honed since Constantine. Selection in archives, precision in decrees, delay in decisions, pastoral spin in homilies. Leonardo guarded his genius with notebooks, inverted script, and patronage games. Both play long games. A single parchment will not topple Rome. Years of laity asking different questions might. Magdalene's elevation to feast shows change possible. The female diaconate commissions hint at cracks. The archive openings under Leo XIII and Francis show doors can move. The code is changing already, slow as stone settling after an earthquake. Perhaps the Vatican is not hiding the truth of the Da Vinci Code so much as surviving the consequences of acknowledging it. Admit, early communities saw Mary lead, and you must explain centuries of exclusion. Admit Leonardo painted hints, and you must rewrite catechesis on art. Or you can do what Rome excels at, reinterpret without capitulation. Tonight we traced dates, weighed facts, sifted rumor. We found no smoking gun, but a pattern of curated memory. That pattern is the real mystery. It is not solved by a key under a rose, but by patience, scholarship, and courage to keep asking. The lamps in those rooms burn low, not to blind you, but to make you squint and see slowly. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.